They called it the Gauntlet. That was the name the Veth'kai used for the stretch of interstellar space between the cradle cluster and the outer rim. 9 light-years of nothing, hard vacuum and radiation, and the occasional rogue body tumbling through the dark without a sun to call its own. The Veth'kai had crossed it 30,000 years ago, and they had never forgotten the cost. They had seeded their history with it, built temples to the dead who didn't survive, sung slow harmonic dirges for the generation ships that broke apart mid-crossing, their hull ice cracking under the relentless pressure of cosmic rays and micrometeorite bombardment, their crews becoming part of the void they'd tried to cross. The gauntlet was the reason the Veth'kai did not believe in panspermia. You did not survive the void between stars. Nothing did. The void was the end of all things, cold, absolute, patient. Life was local. Life was fragile. Life clung to warmth and light and planetary mass, and if it wandered too far, it became something else. Debris, silent passengers on a one-way journey into nothing. This was the cosmology that Commander Sari of the Veth'kai Deep Survey Fleet had carried his entire professional life. Elegant in its simplicity, comforting even. The universe was not crowded. Intelligence was rare, perhaps singular. The Veth'kai were exceptional, not just in fact, but in principle. He was thinking about this when the long-range scanner picked up the signal from the drifting rock. It was a small thing, 200 meters end to end, tumbling on a lazy axis, no significant gravity, no thermal signature worth marking. Classified as debris by the automated system and flagged for the standard skip. Sear almost let it go. He had 47 systems to survey and a transit window that wouldn't hold. But there was something in the spectral red that made him lean forward in his observation chair and pull up the secondary analysis himself. Organic compounds. Complex ones. He made the detour. The rock was called 2047, Veth in the survey logs, which was the kind of name bureaucrats gave things they didn't understand yet. Later, the humans would give it a different name entirely. They would call it the Cradle, and they would say it with a reverence that made Sear's secondary tympanic membranes vibrate with something he could not immediately identify. That was 2 standard years later. Right now, Sear stood in his survey suit on the rock's surface and looked at what the drill had found. The chamber was small, 8 meters across, sealed by a compression event some millions of years prior. The walls fused into a smooth glass-like surface by the pressure of whatever impact had closed it. Inside, the drill's sensors showed a preserved pocket of atmospheric gas ancient beyond reckoning, and within it, alive. Not the fossil of life, not the chemical ghost of life. Alive, dormant, yes. Sealed in their own metabolic pause, their cellular machinery wound down to something so slow it barely registered, but alive. Microorganisms. Billions of them, in a preserved matrix of mineral water ice that had somehow impossibly survived the transit, survived the gauntlet. Sear stood for a long time looking at the sensor readout. His survey partner, a young lieutenant named Ash Veth, whose exoskeletal plates still carried the pale iridescence of youth, came up beside him and read the numbers and then stood equally still. "That's not possible," Ash Veth said finally. "No," Sear agreed. They looked at each other. Where did it come from? Sear pulled up the trajectory analysis. The rock had been traveling for a very long time. The composition suggested origin, not from any Veth'kai system or any system he recognized from the survey charts. It came from the direction of the outer rim, from a cluster of G-type stars that his people had cataloged but never visited. The numbers said it had been traveling for 300 million years. He said this out loud, and Ash Veth made the low resonant sound that was the Veth'kai equivalent of a sharp intake of breath. "Then the organisms are from somewhere else," Sear said. "Yes." He did not say what he was thinking next, which was, and if they can survive 300 million years in the void, sealed in rock, drifting between stars, what else can? The analysis took 6 weeks. Sear ran it himself twice, because the implications were too significant to hand to a junior researcher and too strange to trust to automated interpretation. The organisms were prokaryotic, simple, ancient, beautiful in their simplicity, the kind of life that doesn't waste energy on complexity, because complexity is a luxury and survival is a discipline. Their chemistry was recognizable at the base level: carbon chains, water, phosphorus, the architecture of the thing that makes life. But they were not Veth'kai life. They were not any life Sear had cataloged. They were something else entirely, something from somewhere else. When he filed the report, the Survey Fleet's Senior Biology Division sent back a message that took 4 days to arrive at his position. It said, in the clipped formal language of institutional disbelief, Findings non-conclusive. Recommend additional analysis before dissemination. Siri stared at the message for a while. Then he sent a copy of the full dataset to the Veth'kai Academy of Natural Sciences, the Outer Rim Research Consortium, and 3 independent researchers whose work he respected. He flagged it Priority 1. He included at the end a note that was not in the official report. The organisms are alive. The gauntlet did not kill them. I believe they have been traveling for longer than the survey fleet has existed, longer than the Veth'kai have had written language, longer than our entire recorded history of attempting to understand the cosmos. Whatever you do with this information, do not ignore it. Then he pointed his survey ship toward the G-type cluster on the far side of the void and started to fly. The G-type cluster had 6 stars. 3 of them had planets. 2 of those planetary systems were dead. Cracked stone and ancient cratering, the kind of landscapes that said, something tried here and failed. But the third had a world. Blue-white from a distance, the kind of color that meant liquid water on the surface, that meant atmosphere thick enough to scatter light, that meant, potentially, possibly, against all probability, the same thing the rock had suggested. Seer held his orbit for 12 hours before he allowed himself to say it, and when he did, he said it quietly to the ship's log, in a voice that he made certain was steady. There is a biosphere. He spent 3 weeks in passive survey. He did not want to disturb anything. This was instinct, not protocol. Protocol would have had him launch a dozen active probes immediately. But Sayre felt something when he looked at that blue-white world that he didn't have a word for in Veth'kai. He felt it the way you feel something when you encounter a piece of music so precisely tuned to your own grief that you understand, for the first time, that you were not alone in feeling it. He felt kinship. The world had complex life. More than that, it had intelligence, tool use, communication. The electromagnetic spectrum coming off the planet was not background noise. It was structured. It was intentional. They were building things. They were talking to each other. They had cities. Seer documented everything. He cross-referenced the biochemistry of the atmospheric signatures with the organisms in the rock. The match was not perfect. 300 million years of divergent evolution will do significant work on a genome, but the base architecture was there. The same carbon chains, the same fundamental language that life uses to speak to itself. They shared an ancestor. The organisms in the rock, his silent passengers, his impossible survivors, had seeded this world, or had been seeded from it. The journey had gone in some direction. Some direction between these 2 systems, and all the life he was looking at right now, down on that blue-white surface, was the result of something surviving the void. Something riding a rock. Something too stubborn to die in the dark. Seer sat with that for a while. Then he sent a communication drone home, full of data, and he settled in to learn everything he could about the people on the world below. The humans had been watching the sky for a long time. This was the first thing Seer understood as he compiled months of passive intelligence into something like a portrait. They had built instruments to look outward. They had launched objects of their own into the void, primitive by Veth'kai standards, slow, fragile, carrying recordings of their voices and their music and the coordinates of their world. They had sent these things out and not waited for a reply, not because they were confident one would come, but because the act of reaching mattered to them. Seer found this interesting. The Veth'kai had built instruments to look outward too, but they had done it with the assumption that they were exceptional, that looking was a formality, that the universe would confirm what they already knew. The humans looked outward with something different in their faces. He could not see their faces yet. He was working from atmospheric data and electromagnetic intercepts, pieced together into behavioral models. But the signal structure of their communication said something about the communicators. There was a quality he was learning to recognize, a frequency and recursion to their exchanges that he began to think of, tentatively, as hope. They were not certain they were alone. They hoped they were not. They looked at the sky and sent music into it because they understood, somehow, that the universe was not silent and cold and indifferent, but was instead a garden, vast and strange, possibly full of things that had not yet found each other. They were right. He found this unbearable in a way he could not fully explain. Seer was not supposed to make first contact alone. This was the fundamental protocol of Veth'kai deep survey work, and it was a protocol with very good reasons behind it. Species encountering each other without the mediation of diplomatic infrastructure had a bad historical record. full of misunderstandings that became conflicts, that became catastrophes. He knew this. He had read the histories. But the survey fleet had been quiet for 8 months now, and the reply from the Academy had come in last week, and it had said something that made him sit in his bunk for a long time in the dark. It said, "The organisms are Veth'kai in origin. The rock must have been contaminated during the survey process. Recommend sterilization protocol and formal investigation. The biosphere of the target world is to be classified as independent emergence until further notice. Do not, under any circumstances, allow your findings to be weaponized by the directed panspermia lobby." Seer read the message 3 times. Then he looked at the genomic data he'd spent 8 months collecting and cross-referencing. He looked at the base chemistry he'd matched, painstakingly, across 300 million years of divergent evolution. He looked at the trajectory model that showed the rock's origin, definitively, not from any Veth'kai system, but from a point in space, equidistant from his survey position and the world below. He looked at all of it. Then he opened a reply and typed, "The organisms are not Veth'kai in origin. The contamination theory is mathematically impossible. I understand what you are asking me to do, and I want you to understand why I cannot do it." He hit send. Then he started preparing a landing profile. The descent capsule held 2. Seer took Veth. He had not asked permission. He had stopped asking permission approximately 6 months ago, around the time he realized that the institution he'd spent his career serving was more interested in being exceptional than in being right. They came down in a desert, in the dark, because the human settlement patterns showed thin population in this region, and because landing in a city seemed both logistically complex and unkind. The capsule settled into sand and rock with a sound like something final. Seer cracked the hatch. The air hit him. It was thick, rich, carrying the metabolic signatures of an entire biosphere, pollen and moisture, and the distant scent of whatever was burning in some settlement over the horizon. He took a breath without the suit's filter. Veth looked at him, alarmed. "The atmospheric analysis was thorough," Seer said. "Nothing here will kill us immediately." Immediately is doing a lot of work in that sentence. "Yes," Seer agreed, and got out. The desert was beautiful in a way that the word beautiful doesn't quite hold. There was a vast silence in it, and overhead the stars were thick and bright and looked, from this surface, different than they looked from orbit. They looked closer. They looked like something you could reach. Seer stood in that silence for a moment and looked up, and he found the G-type star that his own system orbited, a faint point of light near the southern horizon, and he thought, "We came from the same place." Or rather, "We came from something that came from the same place." Or rather, "Something survived the void so that both of us would be here looking up at the same stars." He was not a sentimental individual. His psychological assessments back at the Academy had consistently noted his emotional restraint as an asset. He stood in the desert and felt the back of his secondary tympanic membranes vibrate in a way that his emotional restraint could not entirely contain, and decided, quietly, that some things are permitted. They found the humans 3 kilometers from the landing site, which was faster than expected. A small group, 4 individuals, in a ground vehicle, headlights cutting through the dark. They had presumably detected the capsule's entry. They had driven toward it instead of away. Seer found this immediately consistent with everything he'd observed about them. He stepped into the headlights. Veth stepped beside him. The vehicle stopped. There was a long moment. Then one of the humans got out and stood looking at them. He was tall for his species, lean, wearing the kind of practical clothing that said, "I work with my hands." He had gray in his hair and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have spent a lot of time in open spaces and have learned to be quiet in them. He looked at Seer. He looked at Veth. He looked back at Seer. He did not run. He did not reach for anything. He stood with his hands slightly out from his sides. The human non-aggression posture, Seer had cataloged 100 versions of it, and said something in a language Seer had spent months learning to parse. What he said was, "We've been waiting." Seer's translation matrix processed this. He understood the literal meaning. But there was something under the literal meaning, something in the texture of the human's voice that the matrix didn't quite reach. Seer thought about the signals he'd been receiving for months, the mathematical patterns, the music launched into the void, the instruments built to look outward, the hope in the frequency of their communication. He thought, "Yes, you have." He said it back. In the human's language, badly, the vowels wrong, the consonants stressed incorrectly, but the words were there, the meaning was there. "We have been waiting too," he said. The human stared at him for a moment. Then the left side of his mouth moved upward. Seer had cataloged this gesture. It was called a smile. It did not mean the same thing in every context, but in this context, he was fairly certain it meant something like, "There it is." The human's name was Rafael Suarez. He was a radio astronomer employed by a research station 400 kilometers north of their position. He had driven out alone when his instruments flagged an anomalous re-entry signature, and he had called 3 colleagues on the way, and then had stopped calling when he decided that whatever was happening was something he wanted to be present for without distraction. He was, Siri concluded, an excellent scientist. They sat on the warm hood of Raphael's vehicle. Sarah had observed humans doing this in intercepted visual media and understood it to be a casual social gesture, and Sarah attempted to explain panspermia and the rock and the 300 million years. His language skills were adequate but not fluid. He kept needing to pause and reconstruct sentences. Val listened to every halting, reconstructed sentence with a quality of attention that Seer did not take for granted. When Seer reached the part about the organisms, the ones in the sealed chamber, dormant for the length of a geological epoch, alive when the drill found them, Raphael was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You're saying we're related." "The base chemistry." "I know what you mean," Raphael said. "I mean, biologically, phylogenetically, the same tree." "The same tree," Seer agreed. "Yes." Raphael looked up at the sky. He had a small flask in his hand. Seer had been tracking the flask. It was a human social object, passed around during meaningful moments, the sharing of it a kind of communication, and he looked at the stars for a while. Seer waited. He had learned to wait. 300 million years, Raphael said finally. "Approximately. The trajectory analysis suggests something survived that. Yes, in a rock, in a sealed chamber within a rock. The preservation was extraordinary. The void of space is, paradoxically, a good preservative if the initial sealing event is." "Something survived that," Raphael said again, and Seer stopped explaining the preservation chemistry because he understood that Raphael was not asking for clarification. He was doing something else. He was sitting with it. The flask came toward Seer, passed, carefully in both hands. Seer looked at it. He had catalogued the passing of the flask. He knew what it meant. He took it. Word traveled faster than Seer had anticipated and in different directions than he had predicted. Raphael's 3 colleagues arrived by dawn. They brought instruments and satellite uplinks and a calm seriousness of purpose that Seer found deeply consistent with everything he'd learned about how humans approach something that matters to them. By mid-morning, there were more vehicles. By evening, the news had left the desert entirely. The survey fleet arrived on the 9th day. Seer saw the fleet's long-range sensor sweep from Raphael's research station and knew what it meant. He had been expecting something like it. He had been dreading something like it. He went outside and stood in the desert light, and Veth came and stood next to him, and they both looked at nothing in particular for a moment. "They're going to shut this down," Veth said. "They're going to try." Seer. A pause, the report said. "I know what the report said." Another pause, longer. Veth's exoskeletal plates caught the afternoon light. "You filed everything. The data is already in the public network." "Yes." "The humans have it too?" Seer thought about Raphael, sitting across from him the previous evening, his portable terminal full of genomic data, his face doing the specific thing human faces do when they are processing something that is changing them. He thought about Raphael saying, quietly, "This is the most important thing that has ever happened, not like a proclamation, but like a statement of plain fact. The way you'd say, the sky is clear or the water is cold." "The humans have it," Seer said. "Yes." Veth was quiet. Then, with the careful precision of someone choosing their position on something that matters, "Good." The fleet commander's name was Admiral Veth'kai, and she was everything that Seer's institutional career had prepared him to work within, and everything that the past 9 months had prepared him to stand against. She came down in a formal transport with a diplomatic contingent and a security detail that was, in Seer's assessment, approximately 20 units more than the situation required. She met him in the lobby of Raphael's research station, which had by now become something between a diplomatic venue and a scientific base camp. And she looked at him with the particular expression of someone who has come a very long way to prevent something and is not certain they have arrived in time. "Commander Seer," she said. "Admiral, you understand that your unauthorized first contact has created a situation of considerable diplomatic complexity." I understand that life on this world shares a common ancestor with life in the Veth'kai cluster, Sarai said, and that this information is now in the public scientific network of two species, and that this seems to me to be the correct outcome. Veth Solari's expression did not change. The directed panspermia hypothesis is unconfirmed. The genomic data confirms. The interpretation of genomic data requires peer review. I published the full dataset 11 days ago, Sear said. I have received 43 responses from researchers in the Outer Rim Consortium alone. 17 of them independently confirmed the base chemistry match. The peer review is proceeding faster than I expected. Veth Solari looked at him for a long moment. Something moved in her eyes that Sari couldn't quite read. He had spent months learning to read human expressions. He was still learning to read his own people. You know what this means, she said finally, quietly. For our position in the galaxy. For our understanding of our own origins. Yes, Sear said. That's why I did it. She was silent. We are not exceptional, he said. We are connected. That's better, Admiral. That is. He paused, searching for the word, and found the one that Raphael had used, that had burrowed into his language matrix and stayed there. That is better. Raphael found him outside that night. The fleet's lights were visible in the upper atmosphere, navigation beacons and survey arrays and the distant gleam of carrier hulls. They sat on the steps of the station, which had become their unofficial conference location, the place where the not-yet diplomatic conversations happened. She's not wrong, you know, Raphael said, about the complexity. I know. There are people here who are responding to this badly. Fear. The kind that doesn't have a name yet. He turned the flask in his hands, didn't pass it. Thinking. Every time humanity has encountered something vastly different from itself, it's tried to either destroy it or be destroyed by it. I am aware of your history, Sear said. I spent months studying it. What did you think? Sear considered the question. I thought that your species has a remarkable capacity for catastrophic error, and that you seem equally incapable of giving up. Raphael's mouth made the asymmetric movement, the smile. Yeah, he said. That's about right. The genomic data will help, Sear said. Not with the fear, that will require time, but with the framing. You are not encountering something alien to you. You are encountering a relative, a distant one, separated by 300 million years and 9 light-years of void. But the same tree. Will your people believe that? The connected thing instead of the exceptional thing? Some of them will require convincing. Sear thought about Ash Veth, who had said, good in the desert, with the quiet certainty of someone choosing a side. He thought about the 43 responses from the Outer Rim researchers. Some of them have already chosen it. Raphael passed the flask. Sear drank from it. It burned in a way that the chemical analysis had predicted, and the lived experience made vivid. He handed it back. He looked up at the stars, and at the fleet's lights in the atmosphere above them, and at the vast machinery of contact and complexity that was assembling itself around this desert station. And he thought about the organisms in the rock, 300 million years in the dark, in the cold, in the void that everyone had agreed was the end of all things, alive when the drill found them. He thought about what it takes to survive the void, not technology, not size, not the accumulation of power or the construction of fleets or the elaborate institutional frameworks his people had built to explain why they were alone and exceptional and unreachable. Just persistence, just the fundamental refusal of life to accept the void as final. He thought that humans probably understood this better than his people did. He thought they had always understood it, that this was in their base chemistry the same way it was in the organisms in the rock. This refusal, this forward motion, this looking out at the sky and sending music, and it even without any promise of reply. He thought, you survived the gauntlet. You just didn't know it was called that. The formal negotiations began 22 days later. They were conducted in 3 languages, including one that Sarai and Raphael had been developing between them over late nights and awkward translation failures and occasional genuine hilarity. A pidgin built on mathematical structures and the shared chemical vocabulary of biochemistry and the slowly expanding dictionary of each other's emotional registers. Admiral Veth Solari turned out to be, beneath her institutional posture, a scientist. The genomic data had gotten to her. Sear had watched it happen over the course of 10 days. The way she'd stayed late in the briefing room going over the base chemistry comparisons. The way she'd stopped arguing about interpretation and started asking questions about mechanism. The question she asked most often in the privacy of late evening sessions was, how did it survive? This was the right question. Sarah had spent 3 weeks working on the answer with Raphael and 2 of his colleagues, and a Veth'kai biophysicist from the Outer Rim Consortium who had come in person, traveling 40 days to do it, because she said the work was too important to do by remote. Her name was Vel, and she wore her exoskeletal plates in the spiral configuration that meant, "I have made a decision I cannot unmake," and she got along immediately with Raphael in the way that people do when they share the quality of caring too much about the right things. The answer they assembled was this: the organisms had survived because they were not trying to survive. They had no goal, they had no plan. They had simply reduced themselves to the minimum possible expression of life. Their chemistry wound down to near stasis, their cellular processes operating at a rate too slow to count, their material needs reduced to exactly what the sealed chamber could provide. And they had endured, not by force of will, by letting go of everything except the essential. "It's almost funny," Raphael said the day they finalized the report. "How? The things that survived were the ones that stopped trying to be impressive." He looked at the data. No flagella, no complex cellular machinery, no defensive mechanisms. Just the basic chemistry of living stripped to nothing, and that was enough. Sear thought about this. He thought about the Veth'kai fleet in the upper atmosphere, and the Academy's report on institutional contamination, and the way his people had spent 30,000 years cataloging the void and telling themselves it was empty. He thought about building a cosmology around being exceptional, about the energy that required, about what you gave up when you invested everything in the position that you were alone. "Yes," he said, "I know what you mean." The agreement they reached was not a treaty, not exactly. Veth'kai, to her credit, understood that treaties were for parties with established boundaries and recognized sovereignties and centuries of shared precedent. What they had here was different: 2 branches of the same tree, separated for longer than either species had existed in its current form, meeting again in the dark after the crossing. What they signed was called, in the pigeon they'd built, something that translated roughly as an acknowledgement of connection and an agreement to continue. Raphael said it was the most human document he'd ever seen. Sarah said he thought it was the most Veth'kai one. They argued about this for a while in the way that had become characteristic of their working relationship, with considerable mutual respect and no resolution, and then let it stand. The day the signing was public, the fleet's navigation beacons changed color. This was not, Veth'kai explained, an official protocol. It was something the crew had done without being asked, in the hours after the news moved through the ship. Sear looked up from the station steps and saw the lights in the upper atmosphere, and they were, all of them, amber, the Veth'kai color for "we have found what we were looking for," which was also, in the formal ceremonial register, the color for home. Raphael looked up too. "What does that mean?" he asked. Sear told him. Raphael was quiet. Then he looked back down at the desert, and at the station, and at the people moving around it. Human and Veth'kai both, talking, arguing, working, sharing food and data, and the slow, careful labor of learning each other. And he did the thing with the left side of his mouth again. "Yeah," he said, "that's about right." Sear wrote his final survey report 18 months later. By then, the base camp had become a research station, and the research station had become the site of the largest interspecies scientific exchange in the history of either civilization, and the organisms in the rock had been the subject of 47 peer-reviewed publications, and the trajectory model had been refined twice. The question of where the life had originally come from, which direction the seeding had gone, which world was the original, and which was the child, remained, beautifully, unresolved. Sear wrote, in the plain formal language of survey documentation, "The organisms designated 2047 Veth are alive. They have been traveling for approximately 300 million years. They survived conditions the Veth'kai survey fleet has consistently classified as incompatible with the survival of complex biological material. They are not exceptional. They are a data point in a pattern that is, it now appears, galaxy-wide. The pattern suggests that life does not respect the boundaries we draw around it. The void is not a barrier. The void is a medium." He paused at the keyboard for a moment. Then he added, in the informal notation that was technically not permitted in official reports, "I recommend we stop calling it the gauntlet." He thought about leaving it at that. Then he added one more line. "Whatever we call it, something crossed it, and because it did, we are here. All of us, on both sides of this desk, and we are not alone. We were never alone. The garden was always bigger than we knew." He filed the report. He went outside. The desert at dusk had a quality of light that he had begun to love the way you love things you didn't choose but found anyway. Raphael was at the eastern instrument array, adjusting something, his back to the sunset, his gray-streaked hair catching the last light. When Seer's footsteps reached him over the gravel, he turned, and his face did the thing it did when Seer arrived. The specific expression that Seer's translation matrix had, after 18 months of iteration, finally been able to label with confidence. It said, "There you are. Done?" Raphael asked. "Done." Raphael looked out at the horizon, where the lights of the expanded station were coming on one by one in the early dark, and beyond them the faint amber gleam of the fleet's beacons, and beyond that the sky deepening from orange to purple to the first suggestion of blackened stars. All that dark between here and there, all that void that everyone had agreed was the end of all things. "We should name it," Raphael said. "The Rock. Officially, you want to name a meteorite. I want to name the thing that started all of this." He looked at Seer with the expression that meant he had already decided. "The cradle. That's what it is." Seer considered arguing. He had the scientific objections assembled, the naming conventions, the jurisdictional questions, the ambiguity of origin that made the attribution premature. He let them go. "The cradle," he agreed. Above them, the stars came out one by one. The same stars that had looked down on the rock for 300 million years of traveling. The same stars that the organisms in the sealed chamber had not seen and had not needed to see, because they had carried their destination inside them in the only language that life knows, the patient, stubborn, beautiful chemistry of continuation. The same tree. Seer stood in the desert under the stars and felt his secondary tympanic membranes vibrate. And this time he did not attempt to contain it, and he decided that this too was permitted, that the finding of something you did not know you were looking for is one of the things that life is for, and that the void cannot take that from you, and that 300 million years in the dark is not a tragedy but a journey, and that the moment the drill broke through and found them still alive was not a discovery but a reunion, and that everything, the crossing, the gauntlet, the long silence between stars, had been leading here, to this desert, to this sky, to this.